All right, we're back again with another pile. This time, little old 76 Chevy LUV. Well, this is just a body for the most part. This truck has a lot of history, done a lot of little experimental things with it. But if you remember the last video where I tore a cab off of a frame, a Toyota cab off of a Toyota frame, that's because, well, I plan on taking that frame and taking that body and mating it to that frame. Why? Because parts for these LUV trucks are becoming a little harder to find, specifically brake and suspension parts. Because this thing needs a whole new brake system, and rather than go through the hassle of trying to find all the brake parts for that, a little easier to find it for that. Plus, I also have a transmission and drive shaft still for this frame here, so that transmission for that Toyota truck actually has the ability to bolt up an adapter to it to allow you to put small block Chevy or 4.3 V6 engines on it. So there's a lot of potential with this here compared to what we're working with right here. But yeah, mating the body on here shouldn't be as complicated. A bed comes off separately. Probably have to do some welding or some extra hole drilling somewhere to be able to match up to these mounting points on the Toyota frame here. And then the cab, essentially the same thing, just matching up the holes for these mounting points here and bolting the thing down. One little piece of recent history with this truck was the beginning of an electric conversion, where I had this old setup with a Ford C4 transmission that I had an adapter plate made for it, and this electric motor bolted up to it. Now, some might say, hey, why don't you put that back in the new setup? I would, but where I stand now, I kind of want something that's going to be a little more practical, and building an EV really isn't going to be practical for me, not just because of the idea that batteries are expensive, but because of the idea that I'm really not going to be able to do much with it short of driving around here, driving around the yard and all that, because, well, we're too far out to really benefit from using a homemade EV in any way. And I'm sure as hell ain't about to spend a whole lot of money on lithium batteries to give this thing the range it needs to reach town. So the EV stuff is coming out, and it'll probably be used in some other project in the future. So this will not go away, but it's not going to be in here. So main thing is getting this body off. I'll leave that stuff in there until after the body is off, because it'll make it easier for me to extract that when there's no body around it. So I'm really going to start off with the bed, because that's the easiest part to get off. So let's get started. I more or less have the bed on the frame, obviously not mounted, not straightened up, anything like that, but it is on the frame. We're going to probably have to do some hacking on some of these mounts here to try to get everything lined up properly and secured, but we're on the frame. I'm going to have to slide up under here a little bit and do some examinations to see just what I might have to hack or weld up to secure this bed in place. So I'll get back to you in a second. Stand by. All right, first order of business here, I had to cut some metal. Since the Toyota frame is pretty much sacrificed, it only seemed appropriate to cut on that versus the LUV bed, because, well, I don't want to necessarily bastardize the LUV bed, because in some other universe somebody might have wanted this bed, and if I cut it up, cutting the mounts and everything, it makes it more or less useless. So I chopped the bed mounts on the Toyota frame And as we can clearly see, everything sits right where we need it to. Same thing on that side right there. So with that, the next move is going to be to somehow get this situated where I could go ahead, weld that up. I'm going to obviously have to cut this top piece off and then weld it up in there so I can provide the platform necessary to bolt these two joints in place, and then we can move back and try to get a couple more mounts secured. I'll probably go all the way to the back next after I get these two done, because worst case scenario, at least if I have two mounts in the front and two mounts in the back, we can kind of say that the thing is secured, but I will try to get something in the middle done just as well. But let me get this done too. Okay, what we came up with here, these mounts got chopped down. Here's part of the post for the mount. I also chopped off the top piece where the bolt would go through and ground it down, because I'm going to re-weld that right there so our LUV bed post can go boop right on top of that thing and bolt in place. Same thing for the other side. So I'll go ahead and get both of these, both sides there done, and go ahead and we'll move on to the back. Stand by. All right, we got our little top pieces welded in place on both sides. So now, with that all said and done, I can go ahead and muscle this bed into place to get it onto these little thingies right here and move on to the back. So let me go ahead and get that done next. All right, we got our two front mounts secured. So now we're ready to move on to the rear. Let's go. All right, we got our rearmost LUV bed mounts here and on the other side over there, but they're nowhere near anything on the Toyota frame here. So our solution is going to be to take this hunk of heavy duty conduit here, not thin wall, not plumbing pipe, but it's a heavy duty conduit that I had laying around. I'm going to weld it between the ends of the Toyota frame rails. I will end up doubling it up actually, but our next solution to the problem is going to be to take these remaining brackets from the Toyota bed that I had chopped off earlier while making the front mounts and weld these, well, from the front there, weld these up so we provide a new platform for these mounts to make contact with. So I already trimmed up a couple of these. I'll go ahead and line them up, weld them up, and then I'll go ahead and pull this down, double up the pipe, and then I could go ahead and finish weld all this garbage between the two frame rails. So go ahead and get that out of the way. Stand by. All right, we have our mount made. I have to test fit it after it cools down some. Once I do that, then I could weld me another hunk of pipe on here and weld the whole works up underneath the frame there and finish this thing up. So the work continues. All right, getting a look, we can see our mount setup pretty much fits as intended. So now I can go ahead and weld another hunk of pipe alongside this one and then weld the whole works up under here to create a whole new cross member on our rear frame. All right, our doubled up pipe is all done. Now I can weld this thing in place and secure the mounts on the rear. All right, we got our new cross member welded in place all the way around on both sides here. I did have to take the bolts back off after I got the initial welds underneath so I could lift the bed up enough to get around the top there. And then I set it back down and bolted it down. But with that all said and done, let me slide up under here a little bit. Those mounting points right there and right there, they look like possible spots for me to try to anchor another set here. We'll have to do something about our what do you call it, brake line right there if I try to go for that spot. So I don't know, we'll have to look at this a little more, but worst case scenario, I can at least get that one done right there. And we would end up having 5 mounts all together if that ends up being the case. So for right now, we're going to work with that mount and visit that one there next. So let's go on and do it. All right, we have a change of plan here. Instead of making something that would resemble a giant angle brace to accommodate these mounts on the frame here, I'm actually going to go a different route. These little things here were actually chopped from some brackets that I cut off of the S10 frame during that project. They were like a weird, like channel type steel, I don't know, but I chopped these pieces off so when we bolt these up right here, I could go ahead and weld that to the frame right here to more or less create a tab of sorts to secure the mounting point to right here. This will be good when it comes to this side, especially where that brake line bracket is located, and obviously simple in design because, well, I don't have to make some type of giant angle brace or anything. So with that, I'll go ahead and prep these surfaces on the frame rails here and weld this garbage in so we can finalize the mounting of our LUV bed. So stand by. All right, we got our little brackets welded in place. Got a bead all the way around there. Give me a quick second. And we also have a hunk of slag underneath that point right there. As you can see, that brake line bracket is back in place. Move on the other side because that side looks a little bit better since I wasn't really able to grind all the rust off of that point right there. This side's a little bit better where I was able to actually grind some of the rust off so I could get a good burn, but it's the same thing. Welded all the way around, got the thing torqued down on both sides so our bed is pulled down onto these little mounting brackets and ready to go. So now with that, our bed is done. We can start turning our attention towards the cab. All right, when it comes to our cab here, there's a few things we're gonna have to do before we can get this cab off. First thing I have to do is pull the seats out. Main reason for that is because I need to be able to get to where the body mounts are at, especially under the seats there. But in the floor, there's a couple of patch panels that need to be cut out in order to access those there. And more than likely, I'm probably going to have to cut all that garbage out because the bolts are probably rusted to hell. But we'll get to that when we get to that. But along with the seats, I have to pull the doors and the hood off to lighten the load and disconnect the steering column from the gearbox so it's not connected to what's connected to the frame. Lastly, I have to pull the wire and harness going to the tail lights because we'll need that. Bundle that up and keep it with the cab. And once that's all said and done, well, disconnect the shifter from the transmission under there, which is no big deal. From there, we should be able to jack this piece of crap off the frame. So I'll go ahead and get started pulling these seats out. Stand by. We got our seats out, so we're nice and open in the cab here. I think there's a body mount right there, just a simple bolt. I don't know, I'll see in a minute. A few other little things I noticed that I probably want to pull out because, well, not really going to use it in this thing, but a little power inverter setup I put in this truck a long time ago with the intent of giving this thing some extra utility. This will probably be more appropriate in the 51 Chevy since that's more of a utility camper cargo truck all-purpose, so that'll probably end up in the 51 Chevy later, so stay tuned for that. But that hardware needs to come out. Also have a little amplifier, a little cheap amplifier and some speakers. I'll leave that there. But yeah, with that, I can also start looking at pulling off some of this other crap. So I guess I could go ahead and get started with that next. We got our doors off, we got the hood off. Also took a moment to remove all the body bolts. There were a couple of main body bolts on the frame at these corners, and then two of them right by the transmission hump that went into a cross member. And then there were two of them, one there and there. I had to cut out a little bit of sheet metal right there to expose the whole bolt right there. And on that side, I had to actually cut the bolt because that thing was so rusted, not even the impact wrench would break that thing. Then there were a couple of body studs under the bumper right there, holding the front down. Now this thing doesn't seem like it's loose yet, but we're gonna see if it's just stuck on there. Also took the rag joint off on the steering shaft, so that is also freed up. And I think one more thing I'll have to break free, otherwise it will break free when the thing does come up, but our brake lines and actually our parking brake cable, which is nothing more than just disconnecting that one little cable end right there that's hooked up to that lever. Once that's all said and done, this thing should be free enough to come up and out of here. So let's see what happens. All right. I had to do a couple extra little things to help make it just a wee bit easier to get this cab off. First thing is I took the bumper off from the brackets because, well, if I want to put the bumper back on, I'm going to at least have to be able to mount the doggone thing. Go look at that real quick. Yeah, we got our whole brackets for the front bumper intact, so we'll see what we have to do to make that garbage work on the front of the frame right here. Then the other thing that I had to address were our front mounting bolts. These rusty pieces of crap right here, as long as they are, reached all the way down into there. And with these things stuck in place the way they were, the front of this cab was not moving in any capacity. So I had to beat the crap out of these things to get them all the way out. They're rusted all to hell anyway. They're going to need to be replaced, so I'll just get some long grade 8 bolts and use those instead. But at this rate, oh, and I also had to disconnect our aftermarket turn signal lights because they were actually bolted to the bumper. So I'll have to be careful with those so I don't damage those when I move the cab. But at this rate, our cab should be technically free. So I'll go ahead and get ready to pull this garbage off. One more thing, I forgot. I need to put that transmission in the frame here before we put our cab on top, because all this stuff is the Toyota stuff that was in the truck, the drive shaft, transmission, all that. And I'd rather get this stuff in here now while it's nice and wide open, because I don't feel like trying to slide underneath a cab with a transmission jack, trying to muscle a transmission up under there. So it's a lot easier to try to get this in now. So let me go ahead and get that out of the way real quick. Then we can get back to mounting our cab. So as usual, stand by. We got our LUV frame staged here because I kind of want to come in at an angle to be able to pick this thing up, I'm probably gonna have to hook a chain up to the forks over this thing, because I really don't want to put forks underneath that roof or anything and risk damaging any of that stuff, because unlike the Toyota cab, I actually care about trying to preserve the integrity of this thing, even though it's kind of jacked up from a tree falling on it. Same thing that killed the 73 Mustang, but that's neither here or there. Thing is staged. Got to go grab the tractor and the forks, and we'll get to hoisting something. Stand by. All right, managed to get the cab setting on the frame. It is by no means straight or secured or anything of that nature. It is just resting on the frame. I had to do a little bit of fuckery in the process, namely cut a big old gash right there to accommodate the shifter, because in the placement of this cab, I kept hitting the shifter in all points along that opening right there. At least I saved the pieces, so I can always weld all that garbage back in. But the thing is down. Now another thing, there's a couple of spots that we need to make note of. One is on the bottom here. We get down here. Let's see where the hell it's at. Right here, this cross member right here is resting on the floor of the LUV cab, preventing it from fully setting down where we would want it to be. So we're gonna have to work on that, and then more than likely we're gonna have to knock these little body mounts all the way out in order to get everything where this thing is gonna completely line up. Because you can see right here, we got about a good 1.5 inches more that this cab can come down to be even with the bed. That point right there, might have to work on those body mount spots. Probably going to be hacking and re-welding a bunch of crap, but it is what it is. Let me look at the other area that we need to visit. Right here by the steering gearbox, we have contact right here and right here. I'm going to have to do a little hacking right there in order to get some extra clearance so the corner right there will fit in place, which means probably some more hacking and re-welding. But for all intents and purposes, if we look at our steering shaft for the LUV and the Yoda drive steering gearbox, that garbage actually lines up. Once we get the thing shifted over enough and centered, those steering shafts and the couplings are actually going to line up pretty good from the way it looks. And I think these rag joints might actually be of the same dimensions that stuff should bolt right together. But yeah, we just need to gain some clearance for our cab to sit right, and then we can start bolting all this stuff together to finalize this mess. So the work continues. Stand by. Okay, we got our cab pretty much situated where we want it. Areas that I had to really pay attention to in leveling things off after all the hacking and cutting and twisting and lifting and all that. I had to pay attention to this area right here. Have to maintain a straight body line with the bed right there, as well as try to close that gap as much as possible. There's a spot under here I had to cut in order to clear this body mount on the Toyota frame, so I'll be able to poke a hole up through there, and on the other side to get washers and bushings and all that in place to mount everything down. Also in the rear, I had to hack this whole section of metal out because this cross member on the Toyota frame pokes up too much and would not allow the back of the cab to sit down flush. So after hacking all that out to clear, I got the cab sitting where I need to. Of course, it means I'm going to have to weld a whole bunch of crap in here to fill that in, because we're not leaving that hanging wide open. Same thing on the driver's side. Maintaining the straight line and trying to close that gap some. In the front here, I actually had to lift the body up because at those points where there's blocks sitting on both corners right there, If I had this body sitting all the way down on the front, it would have caused this gap right here to be wide at the top, narrow at the bottom. So I had to lift the front up to kind of level off the whole cab front to back. Of course, it also means I'm going to have to figure out some kind of way to secure the front mounting points, whether it's welding a large bolt to the frame or quite possibly trying to drill a hole through that heavy metal through both ends to be able to get a long bolt all the way through with washers for spacers or whatever. We'll figure that garbage out later, but biggest thing is the cab is situated. It's a little bit in the front, but that's because of the blocks. Once we get the rear situated as far as mounting it, we can then focus our attention on those 2 points and try to level things off a little bit. So with that all said and done, let's get back to work and try to wrap this thing up. All right, we got the 2 rear body mounts in place. Take a quick look under here. On this side, I had to sandwich 2 rubber bushing assemblies that were salvaged from previous cab removal. Put a long bolt through the floor after drilling a hole, of course, all the way through. Got a lock nut on there, big washers, all that good stuff. Go to the inside real quick. On the inside right here, however, when I torqued everything down, it actually pulled this floor patch free enough, well, cracked all the old welds, that I had to re-weld everything afterward. So at least that's secured, and everything is, for all intents, still lined up fairly decently. There's a minute wider gap up here compared to down there, but it's not significant. Hopefully that settles through use of the truck. Move on to the other side here, and this side is at least better as far as gappage from top to bottom and the body line. On this side, however, we didn't have to use any bushing on here because the way everything sat, this thing just sat right on top of this mount here. So I used a real thin rubber bushing that sat inside this cup right here, and of course a long bolt with a nut on there to secure everything. So with that, our rear body mounts are in place. Also took a moment to re-weld the metal that I hacked out of the middle of the transmission hump right there. Also still have to re-weld that in place. So I'm gonna go ahead and chop up some metal and start burning that in too before we move on to the forward mounts. So stand by. All right, we pretty much have all our mounts done, front and intermediate. On the front, I ended up drilling a hole at the bottom of the frame, going up to a point just underneath the LUV body mount. That took some time because this is some thick metal. Drilled the holes through there, 3/8, a little better than 3/8, and inserted really long, like 5-inch long, grade 8 bolts through the top. Get around right there. Through the top, through some salvage bushings, stacked with a couple of washers to help close that gap right there, and put a lock nut on there and torqued it all down. Same thing on that side right there. Got it all squished in there. As for the intermediate bolts, those were a little simpler. That was just a matter of driving a hole through the truck frame right here where its old body mount was at, and going ahead and putting a bolt in through the floor where that hole was put at. And there is a bushing squished in there. Yeah, let's get back there. There you go. There is a bushing squished up in there, so there's a little bit of cushioning between the bottom of the floor and this bracket right here. So same thing on the other side. So we have 6 mounting points for our LUV cab body. So with that, we pretty much got our body down. So Also with that, I can start putting this body back together. Well, the doors and seats and all that garbage. So that'll be next. Okay, we got our doors and hood back on. So now there's a few more little things left to do to mop up the initial build. Got to put a little patch across that back section of floor that I chopped out. Obviously, I have to put our seats back in. As far as our little shifter hole right there, I do have to cut a little notch out right around the back there, so when the shifter is brought back, it won't hit that back section of metal right there. Minor thing. And of course, put the boot down to cover that hole. And then the last thing I got to do is put our steering coupling rag joint thing. See how that's going to go on and make it so. And from there, we'll pretty much be done as far as getting this thing secured to the frame and more or less ready for future building as far as another engine, whatever. Got a few ideas for that. But let's finish this up. All right, we have our little patch done. Bunch of little scrap metal welded all in place to fill in all the gaps. Got it closed in. Still got to bolt our little amplifier down. And I also took a moment to get the shifter setup done. I used some self-tapping screws to put another piece of metal right here to cover that opening that was still present. And more self-tapping screws and washers to hold the boot down. So that's all good. So now, with that, we could get the seats back in. So let's get that done. Okay, after getting our seats in, took a moment to start visiting our coupling setup, and after playing around with this whole thing quite a bit, I finally got something together that more or less works. The joint on the steering gearbox for the Toyota setup is still in place right here. This is the coupling for the LUV side. Now, the bolt patterns aren't the same, but they were just close enough that I was able to take this little bracket piece right here from the LUV coupling, along with that part that's on the steering shaft, and put the bolts in and kind of get one side in part way, and then kind of manipulate the rag joint enough to where the two little bushings lined up close enough for the other bolt to go in, and then torqued everything down where it's all together. Now, this little bracket piece here, for all intents and purposes, is almost like some kind of safety thing. So if this rag joint does fly apart, at least this thing is going to catch a little bit on these little pegs right here, so this thing just ain't uncontrollably spinning around while you're going down the road and you crash and die. But this is all together. I didn't have to permanently manipulate anything. If it was ever desired, this whole thing can be disassembled and the LUV stuff is still usable. But yep, our rag joint steering setup is together and the steering more or less works. Our seats are also in, so now at this rate we could mop up a few little odds and ends as stated before. Do have a tailgate to put on. Have some parking lights, or really turn signal lights I still got to rehang. And I got to look at the bumper situation to see if there's anything we could do with that. So let's get this done. Okay. It actually turned out to be that the front bumper was easier to put on than the rear bumper. Mainly because even after removing these brackets right here, I was able to fabricate a crude mount setup to hold the bumper in place. I still have a little more to do, but the basic mounting is complete. I ended up fabricating a couple of mounts out of some scrap metal angle iron pieces that I had, and I bolted them to 2 points on this core support thing. There's one right there and one right there. And then I welded a little piece of not angle iron, flat stock with a hole in it right there. Go to this side right here to accommodate these carriage bolts in the original holes, 2 of the original holes that is, on the bumper, in order, let's see if we could get right here a little bit, in order to hold the bumper in place. So for right now, the bumper is actually on pretty solid because some of that metal had to be manipulated a little bit in order to get it to line up, but it is lining up. As for the rear, I'm not sure what I'm going to do with the rear, if anything, because everything does not line up the way I need it to allow me to put the stuff together without doing a whole bunch of extensive modification to both the bumper and or the frame. But I don't know, when you look at the rear, it does lend itself to doing a crude roll pan type setup to kind of clean up the whole rear line a little bit, and that wouldn't be too hard to do the way this is set up. I could just weld a couple of pieces of flat sheet metal on either side of the license plate area and give it a light roll at the bottom to line up with the rest of the quarter panel and kind of make it just a nice little flush setup, which I might go with that anyway, because I don't feel like trying to jack up all this stuff, trying to get a bumper on here that's not going to really fully line up like I need to. And I'm not going to tow anything with this anyway, because even if I do all that, the integrity of the whole mounting setup is not going to be what it was in the original frame. So more than likely, we're not doing the rear bumper. So yeah, stay tuned for a quick second and show you what I come up with next. As usual, stand by. All right, this is what we came up with on what amounts to a roll pan, but it's not a roll pan in any capacity. Really more or less an extension of the rear valance panel on either side of the license plate there. Adding a couple pieces of sheet metal to kind of straighten out the line going all the way across. I ground down the weld slag that holds those panels in place. I'd probably have to come on top of all that with some mud to help smooth the lines out a little bit more, so it just doesn't look as but for all intents and purposes, this area here is pretty much complete. As stated before, the rear bumper is way too heavy, and I don't have any kind of metal that would even remotely hold that weight the way it needs to be held to suspend it in position underneath there. So we're not even going to worry about that rear bumper probably at all. But for all intents, the basic mounting of this thing is all done. A few little odds and ends left, like that wheel there. I got to break the rotor free so it'll rotate, so I could move this thing where I need it to go. And a few little odds and ends I got to clean up in the engine bay in order to prepare this thing for a future project that I am not going to disclose yet, because you don't show your hand at the table right away. So yep, that's pretty much going to conclude this whole monstrosity. So till the next time, as usual, like, subscribe, notifications, TikTok, all that good stuff. Stay tuned for the next phase of this oddball project and other projects around here. And we'll catch you later. I'm out. I'm done.